Hello, everyone. I would like to thank you, Renata, for your introduction. I'm very happy and pleased to be writer-in-residence this year at the Center for Creative Writing and Oral Culture. I have many connections and friends here at the university, and I feel honored to be working here amongst many fellow writers and colleagues. I'm a writer of various genres, as some of you know already, but for the past few years I've been working steadily on a family history that began with the translation of my maternal grandfather's memoir. I'm going to read a section of this memoir that was recently published in the Malahat Review, and it describes my grandfather's situation at the end of the Pacific War. He worked as a non-combatant businessman for a company that was with the Japanese Navy in Indonesia. At war's end in Indonesia. When Japan first occupied Indonesia, it was Japan's intention to make the country independent and create a national army and military system. The idea was to draft Indonesian men for this purpose and train and educate them accordingly. However, if the Allies attacked, the Japanese wanted this force to cooperate with them in defending Indonesia. After a few years under Japanese leadership, some Indonesian men became very skilled officers. They wanted good careers, but their deeper desire was for independence. Although there were tensions, there was no open conflict during this time. But on August 15, 1945, the war at last made an impact on our lives in Indonesia. On that day, the Navy Transport Department ordered the business corporation I worked for, Nanyo Warehouse, to gather all its employees in Surabaya in the square inside the base. When I arrived, the place was already filled with people lined up in rows. The men of our company gathered together and fell in with them. Although we'd heard on the shortwave radio that Japan had surrendered, we wondered what was going to happen to us. An officer said we would hear a speech from the emperor on the radio. He asked us to listen with the utmost respect, indicating how we should straighten up our bodies. Instead, I looked at my watch. Suddenly, a big crackling noise came from the speakers. I could hear a voice, but couldn't recognize it as speaking a language. It was the emperor, probably saying something apologetic from his heart. And in spite of myself, my eyes grew wet with tears. The thought of him transported me back to a time when I was a junior high school student. I'd seen the young prince as an officer then, in front of the imperial palace. How regal he looked, and yet how vulnerable. This was before he had become emperor. Hearing his voice now reminded me of that long ago memory. And now, all of it, his ascension to the throne, the expansion of his empire, had all come to this terrible end. Japan had lost the war. My tears were for the nation. The next day, the Indonesian employees at our company disappeared, one by one. Obviously something was up, but we didn't know what. Probably somebody with some brains had directed them to leave. A coup d'etat was staged by the Indonesians against the Japanese military government. Every night until very late, trucks filled with raucous Indonesians bearing the red and white colored flags of independence roared through the streets. It was so noisy we couldn't sleep. This rallying was part of the Indonesian strategy to acquire independence. In the beginning, they just drove around, but then later I heard rumors of them stopping their trucks in front of Japanese houses. They'd knock on doors and enter, saying they didn't intend to harm anyone, but that they were looking for the half-castes whom they despised and felt oppressed by. Then they would leave. Some half-castes were apparently taken into custody, or so my employees, Mr. and Mrs. Joyous, had heard in the marketplace. Both Army and Navy commanders had promised the fledgling Indonesian Army their weapons and supplies when it came time for the Japanese military to evacuate the country. But since the Allied forces could show up at any time, the Japanese forces did not want to appear defenseless, so they kept their weapons. As it turned out, their fears were not groundless. 2 days after the emperor's announcement, I contacted the branch head of my company to let him know I was coming in to the office. Because of the unstable situation, I had withdrawn 200,000 yen from the company's bank account, which I stuffed into my bag to be later dispersed to all the employees. Taking this money, I wove my way through the noisy, raucous independence traffic to the train station. I waited for a train, but then realized the workers had gone on strike. I hurried home and called the office again. No one answered. I went out into the street again, determined to get to the office somehow. There were trucks rumbling everywhere. Maybe someone would give me a lift. An independence truck carrying 5 or 6 Japanese stopped in front of me. The driver told me he'd give me a ride. I hopped on. On the way, we picked up 4 more Japanese, but as we approached my office, the truck kept going full speed. "Stop," I said, trying to stand up, but the truck rumbled on, the driver ignoring my cries. Falling back into my seat, I glanced nervously at the others. Their faces had gone rigid with fear. We were in danger. "Stop! Stop!" I yelled again, louder, the others joining me as they too tried standing up to get the attention of the driver. But of course, we were ignored. They drove us straight to the prison. Forced to disembark there, we were immediately checked for weapons. Then they began to rifle through our possessions. I pressed my bag with the money close to my body, afraid they would confiscate the 200,000 yen in military scrip I had on me. But to my surprise, they didn't even check my bag. The prison was bustling with people, filing in and out. A number of us Japanese were herded into a small 30-square-meter cell on the second floor where we were crammed in like sardines. We were made to spend the rest of the day there. At night, we were made to lie down on the concrete floor to sleep. The next morning, when I woke up, the cell door, oddly, was open. When we ventured out, we saw Japanese people everywhere, wandering and milling about, men in uniform from the Army and Navy, as well as businessmen like myself. I recognized some acquaintances and greeted them, keeping my eyes out for others I knew from Nanyo. Eventually, I located the branch head. What a relief to see him. The tense, fearful feelings of the day before quickly dissipated, and suddenly I felt ravenous. I hadn't eaten a thing since yesterday's breakfast. Down below in the yard, people were buying food from Indonesian sellers. After they bought what they wanted, they'd split up into groups, and the noise diminished. Those of us upstairs went down to join the crowd below. I took the money I had been securely guarding and handed it over to my boss. We gathered our employees together and distributed the funds. I kept the money of those who were missing. It appeared the Army commanders and Navy captains had negotiated with the Indonesians about what was to be done with us. Navy personnel would be returned to their barracks at the base. I don't remember what happened to the Army people. Weapons, arms, and ammunition were immediately given up to the Indonesians, all of it, and all at once. Since Japan's surrender, everything was uncertain. We did not know what would happen to us. Presumably, the Allied forces would come, but whether we would then go back to Japan or be taken captive was anyone's guess. The Navy had a lot of non-combatant personnel, more than actual soldiers in the country. They had previously built accommodations in the cool mountains of Maran, in a place called Pujon, where green vegetables were grown for produce. Since our group was associated with the Navy, we eventually left the base and went into the mountains, first by train and then by truck. By that time, we'd heard that the Indian and British alliance had already landed at Surabaya and had engaged in combat with the Indonesian forces and were now closing in on the Japanese army base, where some Japanese forces remained. I stayed at the Assembly Center in Pujon until May 1946. It was a weary and uncertain time, full of long, tedious days of idle waiting. Our lives settled into dull routine. Finally, after 9 months, we left Pujon for our journey back to Japan. Excited and overjoyed at the thought of returning home, I felt light and giddy. I thought we would be leaving on a boat from Surabaya, but the train we were on headed eastwards. We arrived at Probolinggo Harbor. From there, we boarded a boat bound, I'd heard, for Singapore. If Singapore was, in fact, the destination, the boat was likely headed into the strait between Surabaya and Madura Island. I looked forward to this passage, for there was something I badly wanted to see. Back when I first heard the radio report of Japan's surrender, I had the roof of the harbor office I'd designed painted in large white letters, Nanyo Warehouse Company. My plan was to watch out for this sign as my way of bidding farewell to Surabaya. Sadly, however, the boat sailed westward, far out into the open sea beyond Madura Island, and I could not see the building at all. When we arrived in Singapore, we were transported by truck to a special camp at Jurong, located northeast of the city. A vast field had been cleared, and there were buildings here similar to those there had been in Pujon. When I went to my assigned building, I was surprised to meet some Nanyo people there who had come from Midwest Java. We'd lost contact over the months, and of course feared the worst. Tearfully, we hugged each other, glad to be reunited. Among this group was Kazuo Tsuda, with whom I had traveled on the same boat from Japan years before. My bed was supposed to be next to his on this voyage. How fateful it was that we should be on the same ship leaving Indonesia as we had when we'd arrived. Sadly, several days later, Tsuda died. A man who had the qualifications of a Buddhist priest chanted the sutras for him, and he was taken away to be buried. My colleague Aono cut a lock of Tsuda's hair to give to his family back home. I tried to find out about my Surabaya colleagues, Nami and Umeno. Nami had gone to the army base and to the camp assigned to them. They had already returned to Japan on a repatriation ship. Apparently, however, Umeno had fallen ill and was in hospital in Surabaya at the time. During the turmoil of the days following the surrender, the Indonesians had returned him to the Army Base Hospital. From there, he was eventually transferred to the Singapore Army Hospital. I asked the Japanese man who helped us settle into this repatriation center if he could help arrange a visit to see Umeno. I don't know to what group this man belonged, but he didn't board the repatriation ship. He'd remained behind to help others wanting to return to Japan, a truly praiseworthy act. In spite of the fact that everyone wanted to go back to their beloved homeland as soon as possible, this man wanted to stay. It seemed a bit odd. I wondered what other reasons he might have for staying. The man told me there was a lorry that could give me a lift into the city. But what is a lorry, I wondered. The British, I found out later, called a truck a lorry. The Australians controlled Singapore at this time and used some British terms. I wasn't used to hearing their kind of English, so I often couldn't understand them. As I was riding on top of the truck going through Singapore, the Chinese on the street would shout, "Baka yaro," or idiots, at us. I was surprised to hear that. The Japanese soldiers must have used that word with them, and now they were using it on us. But of course, we had lost the war. Dimly, I began to perceive the effects of this fact on our situation. The truck was obvious in its markings. It was for the express purpose of transporting the bones of Japanese buried in Japanese graveyards in Singapore in order to give to the repatriates who would return them to Japan. The purpose, however, of my trip was different, so I would have to wait. The truck went to the graveyard first. At its entrance was a hastily strung up black curtain. Standing below it were several army officers noticeably stripped of their swords. What is going on, I wondered, as some of the men got off the truck. Someone beside me whispered that it was a funeral service for an army general named Terauchi Juichi. One of the officers asked us with some hesitancy if we wouldn't mind joining them in paying our respects. Even though none of us knew the man, he was nonetheless one of the highest-ranking Japanese commanders in the Southeast arena, so we felt it would look bad if we declined. So we all went under the black curtain, paid our respects to the deceased, and then got back onto the truck again. At last I arrived at the Army Hospital where I met Umeno. He was thin and gaunt. As soon as he saw me, he cried out, "Saito-san!" His face was withered and sallow. He'd aged horribly and looked 10 years older than he was. Intuitively, I thought his illness must be cancer. I shook his hand and comforted him, telling him he would soon be able to go back on the hospital ship for repatriates and not to worry. We talked about many things. He wanted to reminisce longer, but I couldn't keep the truck waiting. Eventually, I excused myself and bid him farewell. Just as I'd suspected, he'd had cancer and died of it shortly after his return to Japan. The time came for our departure on June 10th. Orders arrived to board the ship. All the Nanyo employees could board, but we had to fill out application forms. I found out why later. The ship we were on was an American Navy transport called the Liberty. Before that, the Allies used Japanese vessels to repatriate their citizens, so there was no need for forms. Ships like the Liberty were no-frills Army transports. However, we didn't care. We were just so happy to be going home, we didn't complain. When we passed through the Bossu Strait, where the barometric pressure was low and caused the ship to toss so badly that one could hardly walk, the people who normally would have gotten seasick at such a time were nonetheless cheerfully carrying out their duties as kitchen help, producing fine meals at a time when they might otherwise be too nauseous to work. The ship arrived at Otage Harbor in Hiroshima. When we disembarked, we were met by British soldiers. First, they sprinkled white powder all over us with an air pressure hose, even putting it in our underwear. It was shocking and humiliating to be treated like this. Later, I found out the powder was DDT. They took all my military scrip and confiscated my bank account book from Java and gave me, instead, a brand new 1,000-yen bill. Then I went out. A telegram had been sent already to company headquarters about our presence on the ship, so someone had been sent to meet us. That person told us the fate of our families and homes while we were away. Some were given good news about their family situations, and of course they were overjoyed. But others received terrible news of family members perishing in bombings or homes being destroyed, and they wept with grief. Most of us had no clue as to what had been going on in the country because we'd been away so long. People, me included, were experiencing all kinds of emotions. In the midst of all this exchange of news, I was told my family had been evacuated to the mountains outside of Osaka. For people to return to their homes, east and west, we were given free tickets for the train. In Hiroshima, the term used at the time for the atomic bomb was the picadon. When our train sluggishly passed the Hiroshima station, I couldn't believe the sight that greeted my eyes. The city, as I remembered it, had completely vanished. In its place was a burnt-out field stretching out for miles. Little remnants of buildings poked up here and there. The people walking around still seemed in a daze, even though it had been a year since the bombing. The place looked unreal, as if time stood still. When I got off the train at Osaka Station, I could look down at the city below. It, too, had been devastated from the bombings. Expanses of it were burnt out, with the charred remnants of buildings sticking upright from the ground like blackened stumps. But when I looked down at the people milling about in the typical hustle and bustle way of Osakans, I felt somewhat cheered. Osaka, with its vibrant and robust merchant sensibility, would surely get back on its feet. The majestic Hankyu building stood tall as ever, and the trains were all in operation, whistling in and out of the station, regular as clockwork, the way it had always been. With my rucksack on my back, gaiters on my legs, and my war uniform cap on, I looked conspicuous. People would stop me asking, "Where did you come from?" or "Where are you going?" I said I'd just returned from Indonesia and wanted to go home to Higashinose village, and that I was going to take the Nose train. Someone told me I should take a bus from Ikeda to Higashinose, as the train didn't go that far into the mountains. I was surprised to hear that, but the fellow was right. I could only get to the village by bus. It headed out of the city and wound its way into the mountains through a narrow valley studded with old farmhouses of the kind you read about in folk tales. So this is how far the family had evacuated, I thought. They must be living like country bumpkins. Once I stepped out of the bus at the little terminal, I began walking in the direction I assumed the home would be located. There were 2 or 3 elementary school children skipping along nearby. I thought Akiko, my daughter, would be about the same age as these children and might even go to the same school. So I asked them, "Do you know Akiko Saito?" As soon as they heard my question, they ran off right away without even bothering to give me a reply. I kept trudging along, and then, all of a sudden, from a bend in the road, I could see Akiko come running as fast as her little legs could carry her, her arms flung out as she cried, "Daddy, Daddy!" I squatted down at once and held out my arms. She ran into them and clung to me, sobbing. Those other children must have told her they had seen me coming. Holding my daughter's quivering body in my arms, I, too, began to cry in spite of myself. For 4 long years, little Akiko had been waiting and yearning for the day she would see me again. Thank you.